On behalf of my colleagues from across the institution, I want to welcome you to the Smithsonian Folklife Festival Beyond the Mall. For the next 10 days, we will use our digital platforms to share stories of culture, creativity, and the environment from partners in the United Arab Emirates, the Brazilian states of Bahia, Maranhão, and Pernambuco, the U.S. Department of Energy, and the Solar Decathlon, and our very own Smithsonian Conservation Commons. Although this year we will not be on the National Mall in Washington as planned, the efforts of the festival's remarkable staff, interns, and volunteers continue. During this time of profound challenge and change, the communities with which they work have much to teach us about building an equitable and sustainable future. I encourage you to join us often and to participate actively by including your questions and comments in our program's chat section. As the Smithsonian's 14th secretary and as a historian and educator by training, I find the Folklife Festival's origin story to be particularly relevant to this moment. In 1967, then Secretary Estill and Ripley issued the mandate to take the instruments out of their cases and make them sing. Against the backdrop of the civil rights movement and the burgeoning anti-war protests, he and the festival's creators understood that the Smithsonian had to reflect and challenge America's image of itself. By working with communities from throughout the United States and later the world to bring their stories and cultural heritage to Washington, D.C., the festival made space for difficult conversations and joyful encounters through creative expression. Over the years, the thousands of artisans and cooks, dancers and musicians have contributed to building a festival whose work is as relevant and needed now as it ever was. At this moment, in our homes and on our streets, people of all walks of life are coming together, rolling up their sleeves, to operate what Martin Luther King called the beloved community. Manifesting this just society depends on having spaces for hard discussions about racism, intersectionality, decriminalization, and environmental sustainability. It also requires places that celebrate creativity, that spark joy and foster possibility. Yes, culture matters. I am extremely proud of my colleagues at the Center for Folklife and Cultural Heritage, which produces the Folklife Festival, for moving, quote, beyond the mall to ensure that the Smithsonian is able to live its values by amplifying voices in the global chorus of those working towards an equitable future. Thank you again for joining us.
Welcome to Reconstructing Hope, Black Religions in the Age of Black Lives Matter, a part of Beyond the Mall from the Smithsonian Folklife Festival. Thank you for joining us. We are offering real-time captioning and American Sign Language interpretation for today's program. To view the simulcast that includes these services, please use the link provided in the comments section. My name is Dr. Brad Braxton, and I am the curator for Living Religions at the Smithsonian Folklife Festival. Today, we invite you to participate in a conversation that explores the roles of diverse African-American religious and ethical traditions in affirming that Black lives matter. We want to grapple with whether and how these religious and ethical traditions might promote restorative justice and indomitable hope. We'll be taking your comments and questions in the chat, so please participate. This event is supported by the Smithsonian Folklife Festival and is a preview of the 2022 Folklife Festival program, Creative Encounters, Living Religions in America. We are especially grateful to the Lilly Endowment for its generous underwriting of this creative venture. If you do not know the festival, I encourage you to check out festival.si.edu to learn about our programs, educational resources, and more. Now, I want to welcome our guest, my dialogue partner, and my friend, Dr. Anthony Penn.
Brother Brad, it's a delight to be with you.
Thank you. Anthony, these are very challenging times. Over and over again, we see episodes of anti-Black violence. Literally and figuratively, individuals and communities are in a chokehold, whether that is applied through the knee of a rogue police officer or mean-spirited public policies that asphyxiate dreams or unfairly incarcerate Black people or undocumented persons in detention centers. In these days when hope is under assault, I am reminded of those poetic musings, Tony, of James Weldon Johnson, who in an earlier manifestation of the Black Lives Matter movement in the Jim Crow South, penned a poem that would become the Negro national anthem. You know these words so well. Perhaps it's a good place for us to start. Stony the road we trod, bitter the chastening rod, felt in the days when hope unborn had died. Yet with a steady beat, have not our weary feet come to the place for which our fathers and mothers sighed. Tony, as a scholar of Black religions and a member of the humanist community, talk with us about hope. What are the meanings and nuances of hope?
That is a fantastic question. And let me start with a bit of context from my perspective. In those haunting lyrics, it seems to me, is a call to memory. So while we might say, and it is true, that these are challenging times, they are not unfamiliar times, right? We are not talking about a scenario in which violent disregard of Black bodies is just beginning to surface. What we are seeing is this violent disregard in real time. And so it seems to me the moment calls for us to rethink not only our strategies of activism, but to rethink the vocabulary, the grammar we make use of to describe our circumstances and to push against our circumstances. I think we would both agree that comfort short circuits the construction of justice. And so we have to push beyond comfort. It seems to me one element of that push beyond comfort is to interrogate this category of hope. From my vantage point, it's a term that no longer serves a vital function, that it is too future driven. And so rather than talk in terms of hope, I'd much prefer that we center on, in our collective thinking, center on perseverance, right? Kind of highlight perseverance as a way of getting at how we address the current moment from within that current moment.
You raise a wonderful notion of the grammar, the language that we use to deal with our present realities and to try to move through them to whatever is on the other side. When I think about hope, where I first enter into the conversation is perhaps a willingness to want to hold on to the term, but to invest the term with all of its robust significance. So in terms of the memory that you call us to, I'm reminded of the memoir of Dr. Samuel Proctor, who of course was one of Dr. King's mentors and who in large measure was responsible for King going to Boston University and was, as many of us know, a college president during the sit-ins in the 60s. And Dr. Proctor talked about growing up in the Jim Crow South in Virginia. And he said that the difference for them as children was that in those classrooms, to use a grammatical term, the educators, the teachers, the mentors spoke often in the subjunctive mood. In other words, the mood of possibilities. So while at one and the same time taking seriously the notion of perseverance, there was this sense that the brutality of the present could not ultimately swallow the beauty of the future. But what I'm hearing you say, Tony, is we cannot turn away from the brutality of the present, even as we may be thinking about what opportunities there are on the other side of that. So for me, I want to hold on perhaps to the term, but interrogate it as you're calling us and look at it in a way that holds on to both the brutality, but the ability to lean and say there may be some beauty forthcoming.
Yeah. So let's chat about that for a minute. And so there's much of what you say that I have no choice but to agree with, right? That we both are situated in, have drawn from, have been nurtured by a long tradition that sought to recognize the brutal nature of white supremacy, but also safeguard a sense of the beauty, the value of Black personhood, right? And so what I'm calling for us to do is to recognize on one level the ongoing and tenacious nature of this disregard, right? And to do that in a way that allows us to more fully confront the possibility of failure, right? So this is the key for me. If we can come up with a way of thinking about hope that holds to a different posture towards the work, I'm with that. But it seems to me what we have at this point is an ongoing reliance on outcome-driven strategies. We labor because we know we can win. We do this work because we know persistent work, and if you're a Black Christian, consistent work accompanied by a God that is deeply committed to this work will produce the desired outcome. But how then do we wrestle with the persistent nature of this disregard? Its genius is its ability to warp and to shift and to change, to surrender something to maintain its larger integrity. So how do we do this work in a way that recognizes the feasibility of failure? And so what I'm suggesting, underlying my call to reevaluate the utility of hope, is a call for us to privilege process-driven strategies, not what we will achieve, but what we can do now, right? And to recognize that in the current moment, it is feasible that all we can do is muster a profound and loud no to injustice, recognizing that the victory may simply be the persistent nature of our no, as opposed to radical change.
When you call us to move to this place of thinking about process but not outcome, what leaps into my mind and my heart, especially coming from the best traditions of a kind of radical African-American Christianity, and that's a whole conversation we can have perhaps as the time goes on, is that there are multiple Christianities as there are other religious and ethical traditions, and some of them are indeed pathological. We need to be able to say that in an unflinching way. But the best of that tradition, as I have understood it, has, to your point, helped me to understand hope, not in terms of piety, but hope rather in terms of politics. That I actually think that piety, as it is often mediated in the traditions that I know, gets in the way of the kind of robust, radical truth-telling and facing of the realities of the moment for which you're calling. And so, for example, what comes to my mind is the reality in the Christian grammar that struggle with imperial and occupying forces is tenacious, and it will mar you. It will bruise you. It will lead you perhaps to state-sponsored execution. And that sense of, in the face of that, can we call forth the values that allow us to face that with unflinching, to use your term, faith, which of course, if faith be faith, there means of necessity, failure must be an option. Mm-hmm. Any construction of an ethical project that claims to be faith saturated, that does not make room for failure, even ultimate forms of failure, is not really faith. Mm-hmm. So what I'm wrestling with as I hear you, that's really inspiring, is how even within the traditions that feed us and that we are at times very critical of, can we find those North Stars that may be places to help us in this reconstructing hope? So for me, it's about politics. It's about the radical analysis of the power structures of the day and the values that allow us to go through the process to engage them fiercely, even if, as you say, all we're doing is continuing to say no.
As my grandmother would say, that's more than a notion, right? And to do that in a way that allows both theist and non-theist to labor together becomes quite a challenge. And my argument would be both theist and non-theist have made use of modes of interpretation and engagement of texts that matter to us. We've used modes of engagement that have privileged winners. Right. So let me give you an example. I don't think we spend a whole lot of time talking about Nimrod. We certainly don't spend a whole lot of time talking about Job's wife. We talk about Job getting more stuff. But what would it mean to think about our moral and ethical framework from the perspective of those we have typically despised? That is to say, those who have not been labeled winners. So what would it mean to rethink community, solidarity, privileging Nimrod? Or what would it mean to center human agency, human vulnerability, centering not Job, but Job's wife? Right. So again, my argument is that this vocabulary, our grammar, is tainted by assumptions we should not be making. One, it's tainted by the assumption that the proper way to read is from the vantage point of the winners. And we ought to know better than that.
Indeed, we ought. And let me, as a way of moving deeper into this conversation, lift up a comment and question that has come to us in the chat, and that is, is there room for other religious traditions? I'll just give a quick shout out and then respond, and then I know you, Tony, will have a lot to say about that. Absolutely, unequivocally, yes. So that even in the construction of this program, the S on Black religions is meant to do a whole lot of work. I believe that Tony and I may from time to time touch down on particular traditions with which we have had considerable engagement, but I think there is a really wide openness and needs to be in this moment to all of the religious and ethical traditions, both to engage their upside as well as their underside. What I like, Tony, about what you've done is you talk about religious and ethical traditions and the text. And I know we mean that broadly, not just kind of scriptural text, quote, end quote, but the broad resources. And that even, as I like to say, our bodies are text. And one of my critiques is that many religious traditions and Black religious traditions sometimes do not take seriously the living text of our bodies and the emancipatory claims that our bodies make. So that while certain texts may say things about, for example, oppression of women and actually sanctifying that, or where those particular texts may offer very unfortunate and horrific characterizations of gender non-conforming people or LGBTQ people, I have been converted over and over again to radical inclusion and to this move for restorative justice by the living texts that have walked with me and taught me. And I think the other thing that I would like to enter in, and this is really a call for many in my own tribe, this priestly class, those of us who are authorized religious leaders, to your point, must relinquish, as you indicate in one of your books, Tony, the logic of domination. Right? So much of what we do is about domination, so that we can shake a prophetic finger when we're on the wrong side of that, but so quickly then replicate those very dynamics in the communities that we're trying to create. So I want to certainly say, yes, there is plenty of room. We need all of the moral, ethical, sacred help we can get from the traditions. And we need to relinquish our fetish with the logic of domination.
I would agree. And it seems to me, if we are honest about, for example, the history of African-American engagement and what becomes the United States, we have to acknowledge that it's never been just Christianity, that there have always been competing faith claims that have guided moral and ethical perspectives. And I think it's correct. We do need to give much more consideration to these other traditions, these other vantage points beyond the nod in the direction of Malcolm X, right? That this becomes vital. That is absolutely correct. They're more than Christians, they're more than atheists in the Black community. And we need to kind of think through that. It seems to me part of the value in that exercise is the way in which it forces us to rethink our approach to difference, that we have often followed on the heels of the dominant approach to difference. That is, to understand difference as a problem to solve, as opposed to recognizing in difference opportunity. And so on one level, it requires giving consideration to the various forms of engagement that have marked Black life's geography. And from that engagement, thinking through a vocabulary, a grammar that speaks life in expansive ways and for a larger range of folks.
Yes. As we talk about this notion of hope, and as you and I have prepared for this program, I know to your earlier point that we do value that Sankofa backward glance, right? Going back to reclaim some things in order to move forward, whatever moving forward might mean. And you just reminded me of an assertion that Du Bois made, and then Henry Mitchell, another historian and practical theologian, lifted so very powerfully in one of his texts. And that is this notion that even when we talk about Black churches, Du Bois and others reminded us that it took those traditions almost 200 years to become Christian. In that, right, there was this colonial overlay, and underneath it was all of this vibrant African traditional religion and cultural manifestations that in fact helped to influence, I might argue, also convert the worst manifestations of colonial Christianity. And I would also say, I wrote in a book years ago, it was a little throwaway line, but I was really trying to pick a fight. And the line says that the first place that Black folks met God or encountered the sacred, however we define that, was not at the foot of the cross. Mm-hmm. So part of my journey right now as an intellectual abolitionist and as someone deeply committed to the Black Lives Matter movement and a father of a 14-year-old emerging social activist daughter, I'm very, very interested in opening up the pantheon of resources that can help us.
Oh, most definitely. That is absolutely necessary. You mentioned Du Bois, and so I'd like to go to him for a moment. And I'm paraphrasing now. But before Du Bois leaves the United States, he says to a friend, "Chin up, fight on, knowing the Negro can't win." Knowing the Negro can't win. And so it seems to me that statement, from my vantage point, is important because, again, it pushes against the assumption that the only viable strategies are outcome-driven strategies. We need strategies that understand and privilege the current moment and our ability to say no to injustice within the context of the current moment. And in terms of resource, the question becomes the various traditions, the various philosophies of life found within African American communities, for example, what do they lend us that help us to re-envision, rethink, embrace the moment, and come to grips with the possibility of failure?
Here's what I'd like to do. I want to bring in another question that has come, and I think it might offer us an opportunity to wrestle with this very generative tension I see in our articulations between the no and the yes. And my sense is that both of us are very open to the ethical power in the no and the yes. It may just be a matter of emphasis. We'll see as we continue to sort this out. But someone has Jan on Facebook has asked us, how do you think Black religions define hope in ways that move us forward? Here's the way that I would articulate a response as a way of, Tony, inviting further reflection from you and this tension between the yes and the no. What I find to be most helpful, and if you'll let me hold on to the term hopeful, is an experience that I'm living right now that comes out of the best of the kind of Black religious traditions that have formed me. And that is this notion of, at a point a few years ago, I was very strident in my critique about all of the pathologies of religion, and particularly Black religious traditions, right? The rampant sexism and patriarchy, the just incessant homophobia and heterosexism, right? I've been on record saying many Black churches that I know are gonna have to spend at least 30 days in hell, whatever God's gonna do on the other side of that to just get themselves right and purified, right? So I'm on record saying a lot of this. And yet one of my mentors at one point said, I can't hear you say no one more time. I can't hear any more about resisting that which is wrong. I need you now to go build the alternative. And I think you and I may be saying something similar, because this may be part of your process, not just the outcome. But across the last almost 9 years, I have been with a marvelous group of folks in Baltimore, engaging in the creation of a radically inclusive faith community, sacred space, right? Where we take seriously Buddhists dialoguing with Baptists and humanists hanging out with Hindus. And in fact, I'm delighted you're going to drop by and really shine the light and drop some knowledge on us in a couple of weeks. But what I have discovered, Tony, maybe to your point of this notion of the process, is that in this moment where there's a lot of rhetoric about being anti-racist, which I completely get and understand, what I'm also wondering is there some ethical strength for the work by articulating what we are for, by even in inchoate ways building the alternative? And what I've discovered in these 9 years is that construction project of, as Secretary Bunch said in his opening comments, the beloved community does something to you. It is actually perhaps more rigorous at times. So I wanted to offer that the religious traditions I know say something about hope, because they do say, what are you going to build? Even if the building project remains always incomplete. How might you respond to that notion of this anti-racist language that is very prevalent and very helpful, but also the yes that may be contained in trying to construct the beloved community, or at least look at the blueprints for it?
Yeah, let me preface it by saying I'm a humanist, and this is a tradition that for me tends to be too optimistic, too certain, right? Much too certain. And that makes me uncomfortable, because I think one of the things of value within our philosophies of life, whether it be Christianity, whether it be Etha, whatever it is, right? One of the values there is the way in which it exposes us to the presence of the gap, right? The distance between where we are and our well-being, right? That moment of uncertainty that nothing else fills, right? That at its best, this is what it does. And so it seems to me what we have to do across these traditions is privilege a particular mood. And that is a mood of humility and vulnerability, right? A recognition of the ways in which we contribute to the very problems we say we want to resolve. And so I want to agree with you, Brother Brad, on some level, but it needs to be qualified, because I'd say this: I don't think we know what liberation looks like. So we've got to get there by negation. We know it can't involve an environment in which homophobia is unchallenged, racism is unchallenged, gender bias is unchallenged, ageism is unchallenged, classism is unchallenged. We know what it doesn't look like, but I'm not convinced, based upon the few traditions I'm familiar with, we have a good sense of what it is, what it does look like. Our certainty on that level, take the Black church, for example, has allowed us to overlook a graphic and death-dealing sexism and homophobia, because we knew what it looked like, and it looked like the end of racism, right? So again, what I'm suggesting is a greater sense of vulnerability and uncertainty, an embrace of the question mark. We don't know what this looks like because we don't have experience that speaks beyond our experience. So we don't know what liberation looks like. We don't know what transformation looks like, but we do have a good sense of the kind of pain and misery it cannot involve.
Yes. Let's continue playing jazz with this as we bring in another question from the chat. Here's this question. What do we say to the nuns and spiritual but not religious? Many have backgrounds in religion, but find their religion in the movement itself. What would you say to our friends who self-define in that way, Tony?
This growing group of the unaffiliated, we're still trying to get or to wrap our minds around this group, right? They're not all humanists. They're not all atheists, right? They occupy spaces that we have traditionally had a difficult time bringing together. So, for example, some of these folks understand themselves to be spiritual and atheistic in orientation. We've had difficulty prior to them being public about their understanding, tying together these sorts of perspectives, opinions, and postures, right? So we're still trying to get a handle on what kind of orientations this entails. We do know, for example, within the Black community, it's a growing population that is looking for modes of belonging, looking for community beyond the traditional frameworks. I'd also say, though, that it seems reasonable to understand that within the context of Black church tradition, there is, within these congregations, humanists and atheists, free thinkers hiding out, in part because humanists and atheists have been very good at critiquing theism, but haven't really offered folks a soft place to land, a way to think about hope outside of the confines of the theological orientation they are trying to move away from. Good at critiquing the stuff, but not very good at providing an alternative. And so my argument would be, within the context of churches, you've got some folks who find community. They don't have to explain why they're angry. They don't have to explain why they appreciate themselves. And if the theological orientation is the price they pay, they are more than willing to pay it. So within the context of churches, you have this diverse and complex range of thought. Outside, within this new category of the unaffiliated, you have this complex range of thoughts. The question becomes, how do we develop a way of speaking and doing that allows us to cut across theological orientations and provide something that is publicly compelling?
Yes. marvelous the way in which this conversation around vocabulary and grammar and ways of even configuring, inviting dialogue keeps running through our conversation. I would say this and pick up something that you said that so inspired me around, again, this process and a key word that needs to be entered into the dialogue, and that is the word humility. And along with that, I would couple that when talking about those who are spiritual, but not religious, and the various manifestations of that, I would talk about the understanding of the term spirituality. I will never forget when a colleague at Wake Forest University, a Benedictine monk, just reminded me of something from my training in classical languages I kind of knew, but had not heard it so simply. He said, spirituality, you know, Brad, comes from the Latin word spiritus, which simply means wind or breath. And what I have found, for example, when I was leading the Center for the Study of African American Religious Life at the Smithsonian National Museum of African American History and Culture, and talking to lots of religiously diverse people, what I found, Tony, to be very compelling when I would give tours in that beautiful building that I call our nation's Temple to Freedom, I would discover that using this language of accountability for breath is inviting, right? It doesn't have to necessarily be transcendental or theistically oriented, right? There is a sense of we are stewards of a life force, and we must, whether that is just to one another, our tribe, we must give an account. Here's your process of how we use our life force while we are here. Mm-hmm. And so for me, I think, again, there's this opportunity to reach for language, sometimes that may be inherent in the tradition and sometimes may come from other places that invite us to think about common experience, right? Yeah. The notion of my life force has value. It is not just mine. It must be put in service of others. Might be an ethical claim that I might make. So again, the vocabulary is important to creating the kinds of coalitions that I know you and I are interested in building.
Yeah. I mean, I like that, Brother Brad, because on one level, it pushes us to dig deep, right? To kind of move beyond superficial acquaintance and look deep. Are there points about which we agree? Is there a kind of general mood or posture towards the world that we can all make use of? And so, you know, it's regardless of what some might think, it has not been my mission to padlock churches, mosques, and synagogues, right? My goal is to decrease the harm that theists and non-theists do in the world. And so I've wanted to think about that in terms of our action. But again, as we're talking about it now, I also want to do that in terms of our vocabulary, our language, our grammar, how we describe our circumstances and our need. And so this is the question, and I think it underlies what you're getting at as well. If our fundamental concern is the transformation of circumstances so as to produce possibility for profound life, what are we willing to give up?
Yes.
Right? What are we willing to give up in order to have opportunity to push for what we say we want? And I don't think we've spent enough time wrestling with that question. What are we willing to give up? We've tried to simultaneously preserve tradition and push for transformation. And I don't know it's always feasible to do both.
In that call to a certain posture and ethic of relinquishment, you also get at the center of power, because so much of this is, right, this tricky way that at one and the same time we decry power, and yet when it is in our employ, it often is not used with the same kind of moral integrity that we're calling for in those who are oppressing us. It's very tricky territory. And that is why the call for humility, I think, is so very important.
And I think it's key. It's also key to recognize that those vocabulary has to address, it has to name rather tricky circumstances. So I'd like to go back to Du Bois again. Not that he is the only one we're talking about, but I'd like to go to Du Bois again. And in Souls of Black Folk, he notes two problems. One is the Negro problem, right? And we might think about that in terms of the socioeconomic and cultural issues that unfree Black folks have encountered, right? And so we talk in terms of changing policy, economic opportunity, for example, reparations. But there's another question that Du Bois says is pressing, but never really gets asked. And it's this question: how does it feel to be a problem? And with that, it seems to me Du Bois is naming the way in which Black folks have from the very beginning been associated with death. We have not been fully regarded as alive, right? That life is part of the privilege that comes with whiteness. And Blacks have been represented as everything that is a threat to life read through whiteness and safeguarded through white privilege. And so we have to develop a way of speaking, of communicating that recognizes the tangled nature of these two questions. And for us, the challenge today is, does hope figure into that vocabulary?
So let's take another question, and this might be our last one given where we are with time. Marilyn writes this observation: in light of this discussion, there's still the problem that when the battle's over, there is the unequal relationship. There's still the oppressed and the oppressor. I'll just wade quickly into these waters and then let you have at it, Tony. What this observation brings forth in my mind is the earlier comment that I made about this logic of domination. And that while, if we were to take seriously your articulation that we may not know liberation, what it means yet, we may not have gone sufficiently far enough to articulate that with real power, let alone precision, there is a sense in which whatever liberation might mean, it is the attempt to obliterate these categories, right? These suffocating binaries, and to begin to engage life more in a kaleidoscopic way, to talk about how this difference that is in the world is not, to Du Bois's point, a problem, but actually is replete with ethical possibility. So I think in the observation, the notion of oppressed and oppressor remaining is yet the call to engage systems, ways of thinking, cultural productions that constantly have to divide the world into, earlier language, winners and losers.
Yeah, I think Marilyn is on to something. But I would think about it differently, right? We're not sharing all of the same assumptions. So for me, it is never over, right? It is never over. As long as humans populate this world, it will not be over. Now, I understand that some folks may say, okay, that's Penn being a nihilist again. So we're just going to throw up our hands and do nothing. No, that's not what I'm suggesting at all. What I'm offering as the proper posture, or a proper posture towards this, is perpetual rebellion. The understanding that we will always have to struggle against injustice. Always. Right? Again, for me, this is a push beyond outcome-driven strategies and a privileging of our effort to say no. Perpetual rebellion. We will always have to struggle against poor behavior, disregard, death-dealing circumstances, always and forever.
So, Tony, when we do this again, and I hope that our friends at the Smithsonian will allow us to do this again, here's the place where I want to just offer this concluding note, then give you an opportunity to conclude, and then I'll just say a few words of gratitude on our way out of here. What I am compelled to say is that in response to Du Bois's question about what does it feel like to be a problem, I actually do think the extraordinary cultural, religious, ethical, spiritual genius of Black people in the face of grotesque inhumanity is something of a response. And one of the characteristics, if I may merge the text of Black experience with a text from the Apostle Paul, right? I'm a biblical scholar. I'm struck by what Paul, who had some rough moments, but was really trying to engage in constructing of a multi-ethnic community that might be anti-imperial. What he reminds us is that the fruit of the Spirit is love, joy, and peace. It's that joy that I want to talk about. What role does Black joy play even in the midst of the rebellion? Is in fact Black joy itself a form of rebellion or fuel for the rebellion? There's just something about that notion of the joy of our cultural productivity. It is to use Cornel West's term, right? It's got blues in the joy, but nonetheless, there's joy. So I want to just say that. I felt compelled to say a word about joy and its role in Black Lives Matter and in the resistance.
I think we have an opportunity here because the moment is dire, right? That we have to produce our best thinking and our best doing and do that in a way that is mindful of our context. We live in a land of competing faith claims, right? And so the idea that any one tradition will provide the proper vocabulary and grammar, the proper posture towards the world is misguided. It's a much more complex conversation than that understands the benefit of difference. In terms of what you were just saying, Brother Brad, I would throw into that beloved. I think beloved provides us with a way of thinking about this, that we ought to be giving some serious attention to Baby Silk Holy's sermon.
Yes.
Right? It is about this safeguarding, this appreciation of our embodied selves over against a world that is positioned to destroy it. In that, we have a sense that Blackness has been associated with a kind of death-dealing circumstance that we have to recognize and struggle against. Out there, they don't value your hands. Love them fiercely.
That's right. Yes, yes. I do want to give a shout out. I know that there may be a question coming from him, but our dear friend, Dr. Ibu Patel of the Interfaith Youth Corps, who along with Tony is one of the members of our national advisory team, was gracious enough to invite his entire staff at the Interfaith Youth Corps, one of the most creative and courageous interfaith organizations doing tremendous work on college campuses. So I just wanted to give a shout out to Ibu, who is helping us in planning this 2022 Smithsonian Folk Life Festival.
Definitely.
I'm told that we have about 5 minutes. And so, Tony, I want to see, is there anything else? I know there's a whole lot that we want to talk about, maybe on another occasion, about parallels between the Black Lives Matter movement now and Reconstruction after the Civil War. There's so many things. So there'll have to be an episode 2, 3, and 4 maybe of this. But what else do you want to say to us as we talk about reconstructing hope, or even using the term itself?
I'll go back, Brother Brad, to the question I raised. If our fundamental concern is transforming the circumstances we face in a way that allows for radical well-being and abundant living, what are we willing to give up? What are we willing to give up to get there?
Thank you, Dr. Penn, for this marvelous dialogue. I am grateful to the audience as well for participating, and all those who watched and listened and commented. I also want to thank Elisa Huff, Sarah Rothman, Jenny Maycock, Diane Nuttick, Alex Taggart, and Sabrina Lynn Motley for their production, promotion, and administrative efforts. Please follow the Smithsonian Folk Life page on Facebook to get notifications about future events, and find us also on Instagram and Smithsonian Folk Life on YouTube. Please also visit our website and come back here for our next program. As we reconstruct hope, or seek for new vocabulary to help us in the process? I leave you with words from the poet extraordinaire, Maya Angelou. History, despite its wrenching pain, cannot be unlived, but if faced with courage, need not be lived again. Maybe my brother Tony will let me close in this way, knowing that we'll pick it up on another day. Friends, in hope, through hope, let's do our best to write a new script and see if we can't at least begin inching towards creating a better, brighter, and more beautiful world. And whatever else we do, let's do it together. Many thanks.
Wonder.